guests, ladies. This is Rudra Narayan Das. It's a true pleasure for me to welcome you all to this World Human Sciences and Management Conference 2021, organized by Center for Adivasi Research and Development uh, in association with Indian Institute of Management, Sambalpur, and Central University of Odisha. Ladies and gentlemen, the broader theme of this conference is AGNOTOLOGICAL context, disciplinary practices of social sciences, and policy frames. On behalf of Center for Adivasi Research and Development, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Mahadev Jaiswal, Director IIM, and Professor I. Ramabrahma, respected Vice Chancellor, Central University of Odisha, and the convener of this August conference, eminent historian Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda, and eminent policy activist, writer, and philanthropist Mr. Charudatta Panigrahi, sir. Friends, this evening is going to be very mesmerizing and thought-provoking for us because we have with us Professor Arthur Asa Berger. He's a professor emeritus in broadcast and electronic communication arts and arts in San Francisco State University, United States. Professor Berger has pursued his Bachelor of Arts in Literature and Philosophy at the University of Massachusetts in 1954. Then he joined at University of California, Berkeley Journalism School for Media Studies, started learning in 1954, and then he transferred to University of Iowa. Professor Arthur enrolled at the University of Minnesota's program for a PhD in American Studies. In time, he ended up teaching in the Broadcast and Electronic Communication Arts Department at San Francisco State University, where he taught courses on writing and media criticism. Professor Berger has published more than 130 articles and more than 70 books in the courses of his career. He spent in 1963 to 64 as a Fulbright scholar at the University of Milan and has also taught at Jinan University of Tsinghua University in China. Spent a month as a Fulbright senior specialist lecturing on semiotic in Argentina and lectured in more than a dozen of universities in various countries. His works have been cited thousands of times by international academics. We kind-heartedly welcome you, Professor Arthur. And today, Professor Arthur is going to talk about making sense of media, a report from a secret agent. Before starting, before going to ask Dr. Professor Arthur, I would like to invite Dr. Nupur for welcome Professor Arthur and invite him for talk. Over to you, Dr. Nupur.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, Dr. Nupur, Professor Charudatta Panigrahi, he is here. You have to be please invite Professor Panigrahi after your welcome.
Okay. So a very good evening and good afternoon to our honorable guests. So on behalf of this particular Center for Adivasi Research and Development Card Association in association with IIM Sambalpur and Central University of Odisha Koraput, I would like to invite author Asa Berger, Professor Emeritus, Broadcast and Electronic Communication at San Francisco State University, California. Sir, we welcome you here to our platform, and where you have taken a very important topic, that is making sense of media, a report from a secret agent, and it would be really very enlightening to hear from you. Before that, I would like to welcome Professor Charudatta Panigrahi sir to give his viewpoint. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Professor Arthur, very nice to have you as our speaker this morning, your time, this evening, our time. In fact, I've read your book. It's very interesting to know the way you have explained the different facets of mass media. So somebody would be looking forward to learn about media, about mass media, the use of mass media, and the way mass media has evolved over the years. It will be one of the most seminal pieces ever written on media. So we are very happy to have you amongst us today. One or two points that I would like to mention, and when we were discussing amongst ourselves about media, we do that quite often. We do that quite often because media controls our lives these days, whether it's social media or mainstream media. If social media is not mainstream, I'm sorry for calling it social media and segregating that from mainstream media. In fact, social media is now the mainstream media. So how do we reach to the masses? With what kind of information? With what kind of misinformation? With what kind of deliberate misinformation? So there are different ways of media reacting to the societal realities, the societal dynamics. So it will be very, very interesting to hear from you. And one more aspect I need to add on to our thought English. So the use of English in mass media and the use of other languages in mass media and also needs to be understood from the target population point of view. How many people are we reaching through English and how many people are we reaching through different other languages? And last but not the least, very interesting to know how mass media would shape up in the years to come. In the years to come, when technology is going to play such an important role in all our lives, how would mass media look like? 5 years hence, 10 years hence, what would mass media be like? So these are some of the angles that are very interesting to all of us, the participants, and we would be happy to hear from you because you're such an accomplished media professional, writer, and an experienced professional. So over to you, Professor Arthur. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be back in India. My wife and I had the pleasure of visiting India twice over the years. We spent 21 days in Rajasthan, and then a few years later that we went to South India. So we've spent a good deal of time in India, and it's much better to be there than do it virtually, but here we are, we're doing the best we can. So I want to talk about three or four things today. You said something about my background, but I want to go into my studies at the University of Minnesota a little bit more in American studies, because that sort of shaped the way I operate. Then I'm going to talk about how I taught media studies and how people, as I see it, can research media studies. Then I'm going to say something about my use of games and learning exercises in teaching media criticism. And finally, I'm going to say something about a couple of theories that I have that you can find in my writings. So the first thing is I was an English major and a philosophy minor at Massachusetts, and then I went to Iowa, and there I studied journalism. And it's at Iowa. I also studied in the Writers' Workshop, which is a very famous, maybe the most famous workshop for writers of any university in America. Certainly one of the oldest and one of the best. And so I took courses in writing novels and things like that, which I was to use later on, curiously. But it was at Minnesota that really I developed my methodology for analyzing media or anything. So the American Studies program is a multidisciplinary program. So basically, it is, I would describe it as a cultural studies analysis, but focused on America. But I took courses in intellectual history, I took courses in political science, I took courses in philosophy, all of which sort of focused on America, but basically it was very similar to what we now call cultural studies. And I sort of see myself as a cultural studies scholar. Mondays, I'm a semiotician. Tuesdays, I'm a psychoanalytic critic. Wednesdays, I'm a sociological critic. Thursdays, I'm a Marxist critic, and so forth. So my notion is that study of media or almost anything becomes stronger when you use different methodologies and perspectives to analyze your topic. So when I started teaching media criticism, we had a course in my department which involves studying pop culture and media and things like that. I started using books of readings and so forth. For example, I'll show you. We used to always use. There was a book like Mass Culture, the Popular Arts in America. Well, it's 560 pages of articles on different aspects of media. So when you teach media studies that way, basically you talk about the ideas of this professor or that professor, and you give an exam and you ask the students to remember, what did this professor say, what did that professor have to say? And so basically it's a test of memory. And what happens, unfortunately, I think, is that after the test of memory, people sort of forget what they memorized. They study for the exam, they remember what they can, and then it sort of disappears. My notion was different. I'm not interested in teaching what other authors have to say about this subject or that subject. What I am interested in doing is in teaching students methods. So I wrote this book in 1984, Media Analysis Techniques. It is, as the dean of the Annenberg School at the University of Southern California said, it has no data. It's data free. So I'm as of 1984, I'm data free. There's no statistics or data in this book. All it is about different methodologies of analyzing media. And I chose as the four basic methodologies: semiotics, psychoanalytic theory, Marxist theory, and sociological theory. So the first half of the book is what I call techniques of interpretation. And in that I have chapters. The second part of the book is applications. Readers, how you can apply semiotics, psychoanalytic theory, Marxist theory, texts of one sort or another. So that was the way I studied. I taught the criticism of culture analysis. I practiced it. So I call this the title of this after a book I wrote called making sense of media. It is, I call it key texts in media and cultural studies. What it is a list of around 60 short, or 50, I don't know, quite a few, maybe half of that, quite a few articles by people whose methodologies I found important. So I'm basically a person who uses methods to analyze whatever I want. So I actually, when I write, I call up the usual suspects. That is, if I'm writing on some subject that interests me, I think to myself, well, how would a semiotician make sense of this? Or what would Marxists have to say about this? And in my books, frequently you'll find chapters on semiotic analysis of the topic, a psychoanalytic interpretation of the topic, a Marxist interpretation of the topic, sociological interpretation of the topic, and then analysis of various texts using this, that, or the other methodology. So basically then, my perspective on media studies is not to teach students content methods. Now, once you teach them the methods, there are certain things you have to do in order for them to apply the methods. I can give you an example of the problems that, like, semioticians face if they just. I was in Argentina lecturing on semiotics. I went to a conference on visual semiotics and gave a paper. And then I went to a number of universities. I went to a number of universities that had courses in semiotics, and every university, the professors said the same thing. I lecture for a year on semiotic theory. At the end of the year, my students say to me, what am I supposed to do with this? Because if you lecture on semiotic and your students how to apply the, it's basically, you're only doing half the job. I don't want to say it's a waste, but you're only doing half the job. So what I did with these professors, and they all said the very same thing, is I taught them certain games and applications that could be used to teach. So, for example, when I taught, I used to divide my class, and I used to 30 or 40 students in the class. I would divide the students into groups of 3. I would appoint one person, I called him the scribe or her the scribe, but basically that the scribe wrote down what the other members of the team thought about a given topic, but they also contributed to it. So then what I did is I developed a series of learning games so that the students could apply these different methodologies to whatever it is they were studying. So, for example, after I lectured on semiotic theory, we would break the class into groups of 3, and I'd give them an exercise. I'd say, for example, you are a public relations director for a company in Paris. Create a bulletin with images that will signify Paris. And so they would come up with a list of different things: berets, the Eiffel Tower, French bread, stuff like that. And then we would, after each team had come up with their list, we would discuss what they had on their list and see whether there are any commonalities, or if anybody had gone astray in certain respects, and so forth. And so I did that with each of the 4 methodologies. I also, after I lectured on the methodology and after we played the learning games, I would show the students a text and have them write like a semiotic analysis of that text. Now, the text I chose is a text called The Prisoner. It was a cult series in the late 60s in which the spy is gassed and brought to this island where the people want to know why he resigned. So, and it's a very sort of interesting series of episodes. And certain of those episodes lent themselves beautifully, like to Marxist analysis or to psychoanalytic interpretation and so forth. So the students then would be lectured. They did a lecture on the theory. They would play learning games. They would watch an episode of The Prisoner. And then the next class, they would pass in short papers in which semiotic analysis to do that episode of The Prisoner or psychoanalytic theory or whatever it is, whatever methodology I was teaching. So basically, in the course of a semester, we did the four methodologies, and I always started off by showing Rashomon, because Rashomon is sort of the text that led me to sort of think the way I do. I remember in 1951 to 52 when I saw that. It's an amazing film because what it does is something happens in a grove, and three people are involved in the grove, and the fourth person, a woodcutter, looks on and see what's going on in that grove, and each of them has a different story about what happened. That sort of set the model for me, and I started, I'm sort of a Rashomonic critic. I use the methodology found in Rashomon, which everyone has a different perspective on what happened, and the question is what really happened, and that, of course, is the question that people ask. You have to ask when you read my analysis, what really happened, what's the truth of the matter. But I like to think that in showing different ways of approaching things, I'm getting a much better perspective on things. And so I wrote a book which is called Games and Activities for Media and Communication Studies, and I will send the file of that to you. So if any of you are interested in using those games, they'll be available to you. I found that when the students are participating together in learning practices, there's much more energy than just listening. I once read an article by a psychologist. He tested a group of sophomores. Sophomores are always being tested by shooting a gun at various times and asking them what they were thinking at that moment. And what he discovered is that only 12% were actually listening to the lecture carefully. 20% were daydreaming and so forth. So basically, I concluded that lecturing, except maybe in certain subjects where there's a tremendous amount of content that has to be learned in the sciences and so forth and so on, lecturing is without breaking it up one way or another, is not very efficient. So I lectured, but I didn't I tried to do not too much lecturing so that the students just didn't sit there and take notes. So I used games and learning exercises. I call it collaborative learning. I wanted the students to actually participate. And so what happened is after my theory is, excuse me, is that after the students took my course, they would see the world differently. They would now know how to process the texts and and everything that happened in the world with them somewhat differently. They would have been exposed to some of the great thinkers, Bakhtin, Freud, de Saussure, Peirce, Marx, so forth. And it would not only be useful to them in analyzing media, mass mediated text, of course, it would also be useful in their lives. And I have a little story to tell about that. I was in a grocery store shopping a number of years ago, and a woman came up to me. She was maybe in her 40s, and she said, "Oh, Dr. Berger, how are you?" She said, "Do you remember me?" I said, "Of course I remember you." She said, "You know that course in semiotics I took with you 20 years ago?" She said, "It's still with me." So that meant a lot to me, because what it shows is that when you teach students methods and you teach them how to process texts of one sort or another, it stays with them. And actually, they become sort of different in many respects. They start seeing the world a little differently. Now, my students always considered psychoanalytic theory quite absurd. And they were always sort of playing around with me, putting, joking, using Freud's theories and other theories, sort of spoofing me when they wrote their papers on the prisoner. But the fact of the matter is, even though they were sort of ridiculing me or having fun with me, they got into the practice of using psychoanalytic theories and concepts in psychoanalytic theory to analyze a text. And I think that even though they considered it quite absurd, they at least learned something about what Freud had to say about the psyche and so forth. And I think maybe it stuck with them. I don't know. Okay. All right. So I've talked about my different methodologies of teaching and the need for having something in between the theory and asking people to write papers. You have to teach them how to use the concepts. And so one isn't enough. You teach the theory, but if you don't teach them how to use the concepts, it's useless to them. I mean, that's what the students in Argentina all said. And the problem is, you see, professors love theory. So they love to talk about theory, and they don't think too much about teaching the students how to apply that theory to texts. Okay. So now let me say something about a couple of contributions I've made to studying media. Well, I've always been interested in humor. Excuse me. And so one year I decided to investigate the methods humorists use in creating humor. See? This is, I mean, I was also interested in using Marxist and psychoanalytic theory and semiotics and so forth and analyze humor. But I was interested in seeing how comedians, how Shakespeare, how people who wrote comedies and so forth use certain techniques to generate the humor. Now, I'm not saying that they were conscious that they were using this technique, but what I did is I came up with a list of 45 different techniques that I found. I don't know if you can see this, but I have this list of 45 techniques. I actually sent this list to you, and maybe you'll be able to get it. Somebody will send it to you. This list of 45 different techniques that humorists of all kinds use. Excuse me. And then I wrote a book called An Anatomy of Humor, in which I have the first chapter, in which I listed the techniques. And then I have chapters in which I showed how you could use it to analyze jokes, how you can use it to analyze situation comedies, etc. And I wrote one book called The Art of Comedy Writing, in which I showed how these techniques were used by Roman playwrights, by Shakespeare, by playwrights all the way up to Ionesco in the Theater of the Absurd. So that was a contribution I made that I don't think people until that time had thought about humor that way. And you have to understand that most of the work that's been done on humor, there are four basic theories of humor, three or four basic. One is Freudian analysis, in which he talks about it basically as a means of mass digression. There's another another theory which is based on Aristotle, which says is based on superiority. We feel superior to those we laugh at. Another one is based on incongruity. That's the most common one. The problem with those techniques is they're not granular. That is, they talk at a very high level of abstraction, but they don't actually analyze the text. So I've spent a lot of time with jokes and showing how a particular joke may have 3 or 4 different techniques that generate the humor. So the last book I wrote was called was on humor, and it sort of brought a lot of my my humor theories, up to date. But I've written about 5 or 6 books on humor. It's a subject that really interests me. Then the last another contribution that I've made that is, I think is unique is my work on myths. I actually wrote a book called Media and Myth, and in which I showed how myths inform very many aspects of our media. And I developed what I called the myth model. The myth model says you can take a myth, and then you can show how that myth can be found in a historical experience, in psychoanalytic theory, in elite culture, in popular culture, in everyday life. So I sent this list. This is one list. This takes the myth of Sisyphus and shows how it informed different things. For example, if you take the myth of Sisyphus, he he rolls a stone up a mountain, and just before he gets to the top, it rolls back, and then he spends eternity rolling the stone up the mountain. So it's basically based on recurrence. So for psychoanalytic theory, I have a repetition compulsion. The fact that people do the same thing over and over, obsessive compulsive behavior. They're doing the same thing over and over again. They're washing their hands 200 times a day, so forth and so on. For historical experience, I have the reading of the Torah in synagogues, which goes on year after year. They read till the end, and then they start and read it over again. So for 7,000 years, Jews have been reading the Torah over and over again every year. So for elite culture, I have Albert Camus, The Myth of Sisyphus, and you could probably find in many other stories. For popular culture, I have a video game called Rock of Ages, and for everyday life, I have housework, which is endless. Turns out this year, because of the virus, we've been stuck at home. My wife and I have been stuck at home. We were told to shelter in place for the better part of a year. And then recently, with the development of the vaccines, we were supposed to be liberated, but I happen to have immune problems. So in effect, I'm not vaccinated, or not. I'm vaccinated, but we don't know how much. So basically, I'm stuck at home all the time and doing housework. That's basically, I write and I do housework. So I would argue that many of the things we do are basically connected to myths, although we're not aware of it. And there's a writer named Mircea Eliade who's written a lot on religion. He wrote a book called The Sacred and the Profane, in which he argues that many of the things we do are actually camouflaged myths. So I had a lot of fun with myths and with humor. I have a lifelong interest in humor, and I'm trying to think about the next book I'm going to write on humor, because it's an endless subject. So I would conclude, let's see what I had actually written the conclusion here. If I can find it, yeah. Oh, one thing I forgot to talk about. Good. About writing, doing research and doing writing. And this has actually been an extremely important aspect of my career as a professor and a writer. I keep a journal. This is my latest journal. This is number 104. So I sometimes joke, I've written 180 books, 100 of which are about myself. But in this journal, I write every day in this journal, but I also devote certain pages to what I call brainstorming. I don't know if you can see it, but I divide the page into quarters, and then I brainstorm with ideas that I'm thinking of. For example, what I just showed you is I've written a book on Westerns, the genre of Westerns, and in my journal, I'm speculating, I'm writing a list of topics that I might want to investigate when I'm writing this. But I also, at the same time that I'm writing the book at my computer, I'm also writing in my journal about problems I'm facing, things that I could add, so forth and so on. So there's a continual process. I'm writing the book on the computer. I'm writing about writing the book in my journal. I also, when I'm planning things, I use little slips of paper about this size with one topic on each page. What that means is I can sit down at the kitchen table, I can lay out all the topics, and then I can rearrange them in a more coherent and logical manner. So this is sort of the equivalent of, I once saw a computer program that did this, but this is a very simple way to do it. You take a piece of paper, you tear it up into little pieces, and then one topic per page, per sheet, and then organize them however you want. All right, so with this, what I've basically done then in this discussion is I've said something about my notion that interdisciplinary methods or multidisciplinary methods are very useful, and in that, in many respects, what I learned at the University of Minnesota was basically cultural criticism, although it was not seen as that, but in essence, it was cultural criticism. Second thing I've done is I've suggested that teaching methods is more effective than teaching content, because teaching content is something that students, they learn, it's based on memory, whereas teaching methods is based on learning how to apply methods that I think stick with you. Third thing I said is about my use of journals and writing little slips of paper to create a more orderly and organized chapter in your book. So basically, that is how I operate, and that is my notion of how media study should be performed. Now, of course, there are many scholars who are quantitative and who like statistics and things like that. And what I do nowadays is I use their stuff in my books. That is, I'm not a quantitative scholar, but I'm willing, if I find a paper written by a quantitative scholar, I'm more than happy to use it in my book. So the latest version of media analysis techniques, this monster, this is the 6th edition of media analysis techniques. I would say that it has 5 times as much material in it as the original. But it took me 20 years to add on material on it. So I have a lot of quantitative material in this. So, for example, as mentioned, media is an important part of our life. I recently came across a statistic saying that people are connected to the media in America 13 hours a day, something like that. 2 hours on the radio, 4 hours with television, 6 hours on their cell phones and internet and so forth. So it's a very important aspect of our lives, and there are many different ways to study it. What I've outlined is my particular way of studying it, and with that, I end my discussion, and now I'm open to any questions you might have about what I've talked about.
Professor Berger, such a wonderful talk, and you showed showing so much of your great and brilliant works. It's really very pleased to listen. I want to know, as a very serious communication student, not scholar, historical student, and I was a student of communication partly sometimes. I want to know what is the difference between the usage gratification theory and the magic bullet theory? You quite familiar with? Yeah. Magic bullet theory.
What's the second one? I can't understand.
Usage gratification theory.
Well, uses and gratification. What's the other one?
Yeah. And the second one is theory. After
I don't know.
the Second World War, when Hitler and his broadcasting minister used this theory to how to propaganda the radio machinery to just beat entire world and propagated the false notion of war.
I don't know that theory.
And second, yeah.
Well,
and the second one is, please tell me.
I don't know that second theory, so I can't really answer that question. I know uses and gratifications is a theory that people use to understand why people like westerns or why they like soap operas and things like that. The second one, I'm not familiar with it, so I can't really answer that question.
Okay. Then my second question is that, as a fantastic researcher of the globe, and you should write so many books for you, and it's a eye-opening kind of thing for broadcasting and communication both. Tell me something about your own experiences related to when you collecting data from field. What is the oral narratives is most essential part to conducting empirical analysis of research? And second thing is the content writing. The content writing is basically not fixation by these new scholars. Those are inborn scholars into doing research about particular communication or media particular.
Yeah.
And you know how the media houses operating in 21st century globe. What about your ideas on it?
Yeah. Well, you see, when I basically I am in many respects a researcher. I actually wrote a book on research, but I never taught research methods. One day I was at the International Communications Association. Sage Publications published, the editor of Sage Publications was located in Boston. So she took me out for lunch. And while we were having lunch, she opened up her purse and pulled out a book, and it was on research methods. And she said, this book isn't doing very well. Have you ever thought of writing a book on research methods? That was, most of my colleagues in my department would consider that to be comical, because as one of them said to me, what do you know about research, Arthur? But so then on the plane home, I looked over her book and I thought the writing was abysmal, like so many books. One of the things when I write in a conversational manner, and that drives a lot of academics crazy, because they of, in the third person and so forth and so on. And then I went home, I looked at all the books that had research methods. I sent an email to my colleagues in my department and asked them to send me how they taught, the syllabi on how they taught research methods. And I came to the conclusion about what topics had to be included in a book. Well, the first part of it on qualitative methods was a snap for me, because it's a rewrite of media analysis techniques, of certain techniques in media analysis techniques. But basically, it was based on research. So I looked at different research books. I bought a few from the internet and so forth. And on the basis of that, I wrote. So basically, I'm always looking for material that people have written that is of use to me, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. For example, Google has a site called Google Scholar. If you go to Google Scholar and type in some subject, you generally can find some academic papers on that particular subject. So I download them and read them, and if there's anything in them that I can use, I use it. And one of the things about my writing is that when I write, I have many quotations in my books, so that the reader, when they're reading it, they know who wrote it, where it came from, and so forth and so on. Don't have to go to the appendix or see where it came from. So I'm open to anything I can find that will be useful to me when I'm writing these books. So then what happens is, in the course of writing a book, sometimes one idea leads to another idea. That is, I believe that many of us have in our heads all kinds of ideas that are not accessible to us. And so sometimes the nice thing about writing a journal is that when you're writing a journal, if this idea comes into your head, I write it down in my journal. So it's available for me when I write the book. But I use whatever methodology strikes me as useful. Now, the ones that I'm attracted to, of course, are the semiotic analyses, because I think the semioticians have a lot to say about almost every subject. But Peirce said everything in the universe is a sign. So that means semioticians can analyze anything. And they do, I have a book on creativity, the creative process, that I'm about to send to my publisher. And I have a chapter on the semiotic analysis of creativity. And I asked a semiotician, a practicing semiotician, that is a commercial semiotician, he works for advertising agencies and marketing companies, to write his particular take on the creative process. So, and then I added a chapter. My reviewer said I should have something on biosemiotics. So I had to learn about biosemiotics. So I learned about biosemiotics, which is one aspect of semiotics I never was too involved with. But the point I'm making is I'm sort of open to any methodology, as long as I think that it makes sense. And then the readers can decide whether they think that it's useful or interesting, or I want to forget about it. So I wouldn't say that this methodology or that methodology strikes me as all important or anything like that, but anything that I find that I think sheds light on the particular topic I'm writing about, and usually it's in the form of a quotation from some thinker, or sometimes frequently writers, journalists, so forth and so on, have had interesting things to say about certain topics. I use it. So, like uses and gratifications, yes. In this book on Westerns, I list some of the uses and gratifications that Western readers obtain by reading these Westerns. I was asked to write this book on Westerns by the publisher of a company that produces Westerns. And the problem I have is that when when you start writing about Westerns, you get into the Oedipus complex, into, like if you take a film like Shame, there's certain Oedipal aspects of things. I'm thinking, the people who read these Westerns, are they going to be interested in reading about, Marxist analysis of Westerns or the Oedipus complex in Shane? So I don't know whether it's a lost mission, but in any case, he's reading it over, and if he doesn't take it, I'll send it to a regular publisher. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but all I'm saying is that I'm eclectic in my use of techniques and methods in analyzing media. If I find data that's interesting, I add that too. Yeah.
Okay. This is my last question for you, Professor Berger. To just, in addition to follow up your answers, the data is saying only 3% people of the globe, they are reading newspapers, right? And only 1.1% people reading magazines.
Yeah.
31 people are watching television, and 43% are users of this laptop or social media.
Yeah.
What is your observations during your field studies and a maximum numbers of wrote in your book as a fantastic electronic communicator of the globe now at present? How do you believe the balanced news should be circulated throughout the globe?
Yeah, it's that's a terrible problem. I can recall statistics in one of my books about the amount of time people spend reading newspapers, reading print. It's pathetic. It's like 5 minutes a day, or maybe 15 minutes a day, something like that. And they're spending 4 hours on television, 2 hours on 2 hours. Well, first of all, and I'm unusual in that respect. I read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and another. I read 3 newspapers. I used to read 4 newspapers every day. But it's a burden. It's a tremendous burden. I mean, like if you get the Sunday Times, it's gigantic. So there are some people, maybe it's a sign of my age. I'm a very senior citizen. So people are my age read newspapers. But like my daughter, who's a psychoanalyst, doesn't read a newspaper, but she reads, she gets stuff on the internet. So a lot of people get stuff on the internet. There's a lot of news programs, like many people, alas, a huge number of people in America, mostly of a conservative and Republican perspective, watch only one channel, and that's Fox. So they're not getting news. They're getting basically Fox is an instrument of the Republican Party, and it's full of people who tell them not to get vaccinated and things like that. Although they're changing now because this new variation is killing people, very quickly. So it's a tremendous problem. Well, one of the things that the newspapers have done is they've gone electric. So, for example, I pay $26 a year, and I get stuff from the Atlantic, which is a wonderful magazine, and has very good articles. I also, because I subscribe to the New York Times, I get the New York Times on the internet too. So basically, I'm getting a huge number of sources on the internet that sort of augment what I read in the newspapers. So I not only do I read the newspaper, but I also read a lot of electronic news. Like my son, he's a mathematician. He has a PhD from Columbia in math, and he works for Google. He doesn't get a newspaper either. He only gets a Sunday newspaper, but he reads a lot of news on the internet. So you can get a tremendous amount of news. And then there's for people, for example, America is divided into sort of 3 groups of people as far as news is concerned. You have like the Trump followers and Republicans are watching Fox and maybe nothing else. We talk about news silos. That's one of the problems. In the old days, there were 3 networks, and you watch one of the networks. And with Fox, you're just preaching to the converted, basically. And it's absolutely shameful what some of those people are doing. They've led many Americans to be afraid of getting vaccinated. And so they're dying in huge numbers. And now even Fox, they're telling people, some people are telling people to get vaccinated, and the people who work for Fox have to be vaccinated. Then you have MSNBC, which is the anti-Fox, which is for liberals and progressives and people like that, and that's anti-Trump. So that's full of programs, and there's a whole bunch of people, senators, members of the House, writers, and so forth, who are on all these two networks, who are espousing their particular cause. And then there are the conventional programs, and PBS, ABC, so forth and so on, that have traditional kind of newscasts. So there's a tremendous amount of news out there, and I imagine that a lot of people are getting news, but not from newspapers. So the problem newspapers have is how to survive, and the way they're doing it. Of course, a lot are dying, but the way the ones that are surviving are doing it is by going electronic. Like the Washington Post is electronic in many respects, and it's doing very well. So what to do about newspapers? If I could answer that question, they'd be beating a path to my door. But nobody has been able to figure out how to get people to read newspapers, magazines, and so on. There's a small group of intelligentsia, I guess I would call them, who read newspapers and magazines, and like the New Yorker and Atlantic and Harper's and things like that. But it's a terrific problem. I think people sort of get some news, through Fox and so forth, and these other things. But how newspapers anywhere? I don't know about in India, but in America, we've lost a lot of newspapers, and the newspapers we have are just fragments of themselves. Files, for example, I read the New York Times and I read the Wall Street Journal every day. And we also get a local newspaper called the Marin IJ, which used to be 40 pages long and is now about 20 pages long. So we get hardly anything. And then most of the newspaper is stuff that they pasted in from the Associated Press or from the New York Times. And they have a few reporters who report local stuff and so on. But it's just a fragment of what it used to be. But I wouldn't get it, but my wife loves their crossword puzzles. So basically we get that newspaper, which is much more expensive than the New York Times, if you can imagine it. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but the subject you raise is a real perplexing one. We don't know what to do about newspapers, and we're trying to figure out how to solve the problem of getting people access to news. Yeah. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all the answers, sir. Sir, here is one question from Satabdi Benia from Central University. She is a student researcher. We want to ask you, the session was indeed amazing. Could you please explain a bit about infodemic?
About what? I can't understand your last word.
Infodemic. Yeah, infodemic.
Would you spell that for me? I can't understand it.
Satabdi, can you ask the question directly?
Yeah, ask.
Hello?
Your accent is such that I cannot understand what you said.
Okay. No issue, sir. I will invite her to ask.
I'm terribly sorry, but I
Hello?
can't understand that word. I don't know what you want me to say.
I would like to, Dr. Lima, to just, yeah, sir, 1 minute. Dr. Lima, to just conduct the question answer session, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Jana. If Subham will allow or let her allow to speak, then she can ask directly, or anybody can ask directly, or just I would like to read out what exactly Satabdi asked to Professor Berger. Could you please explain a bit about infodemic?
In
What infodemic. So also that
infodemic. Okay. Infodemic. Okay, now I understand. Well,
or anybody can ask directly if
yes,
Shubham will allow.
yes,
Yes, over
yeah.
to Professor Berger.
Yes, well, that's the other part of it. That is, we have some people who don't read newspapers, who know nothing, and then the other part of it is we're bombarded by information. Every minute, every minute we're bombarded by information. Consider, for example, the rise of TikTok. TikTok are these crazy videos of dogs relating to cats and so on. The point is, whenever you're on the internet, you're getting information. It may not be news, it may be advertisements and so on, but all of that is information. And the problem is people are bombarded by so much information that it sort of loses its effect. There have been studies, for example, of advertising in which they've asked people about, they've shown people advertisements, and they asked them about an ad that wasn't, they made up that there was an ad, they made up an ad that wasn't actually shown, and the people talked about it. Because there's so much information that people can't process it all. And so basically what they do is they have filters, and these filters enable them to make sense of whatever little bit that sort of interests them. But when you have too much of anything, it sort of loses its effectiveness, and it becomes a kind of blob of information that people can't really process. So it is a problem. On one hand, we have people who don't get any news, and on the other hand, we have people who are bombarded by information. I mean, when you're on the internet, you're being bombarded by information all the time, and we're exposed to thousands of advertisements every day. If you watch 4 hours of television, that means you're watching 1 hour of commercials in America. Anyway, in America, it's 1 hour of commercials. Those commercials can be anywhere between 10 seconds and 30 seconds as a rule. So think of the number of commercials, and all of which are trying to convince you to do something that you're exposed to. So I think in the course of a day, if you add up the television programs, the stuff we watch on the internet, newspapers, magazines, if anybody who reads any of them anymore, you are in a world in which we have an excess of media and an excess of information. And so what happens is it sort of becomes a blur, and people only remember a few sort of strange, curious things that may be related to their personality. It's a tremendous problem, and I don't think there's any way of changing it except if people cut down on the amount of media to which they're exposed. But that's very difficult, especially since we had the pandemic and people relied on the media to a considerable amount of, to sort of pass the day, watch more television, spend more time on Zoom, and so forth and so on. I can't figure out, I can't offer you any methods of dealing with that other than cutting down on the amount of, it's like people who eat too much. Well, if you can eat less, then you're not going to gain as much weight and you won't have to worry about it. But trying to convince people to cut down on their media usage is like trying to get people to eat less than they're used to eating. And I don't know if anyone has figured out how to deal with that. I'm sorry, I didn't understand the word. It's sometimes the accents are a little difficult for me to take because the sound on my computer isn't very good.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Arthur. Dr. Jana, any question from anybody, or Nupur? Nupur is here. Can you give the
Yes,
last
yes, I'm
comment?
here.
Yeah. Okay, can you give the last comment,
Yes, yes,
Nupur?
I'm
Yes,
there.
yes, you go ahead. Nupur will give the comment on this topic.
So am I clearly audible?
Yes, you go ahead.
So, respected sir, it was really great having you over here. The way you analyzed us about the media behavior, the behavioral mechanisms. So media is a very important part in the democratic system, and media plays a very major significant role in today's society. And the purpose of media is not only to give information, but it has being socializing people in several ways. It has transformed our culture, our way of thinking, our behavioral ways of life, and many more things. So, as sir, it was really great to have you, as you have been doing a lot of work on media and communication research methods, media analysis techniques, media research techniques, and the narratives in popular culture, media, and everyday life. There are many books and works that you have done, sir. And I have been also reading some of your books in the recent past. So, sir, it was really great, and the way you have explained us about the different theories and how the experiences have been formed, how by living with the media, and how you have worked with the things, and how you have taken out an innovative way of understanding the society and understanding the people around you. So it was really incredible listening to you and being a part, and we all are indebted by listening to you. And your book, another thing, sir, it is really impressible. I would like to say your book on semiotics and cultural criticisms. So cultural criticisms, a book where you have said about the semiotics and semiology, that everything, there is a sign towards everything and we have to understand it. So that really is really very universal phenomenon. We have to understand the science, and it really works out. And thank you so much, sir, for being a part of here. It was really an excellent deliberation by you. We all are indebted by that. Thank you so much, sir.
Yes, another question, the last question, what Satabdi asked. Can you read out, Nupur, Satabdi,
there is
the last
one,
question?
does fear of missing out people to get into misinformation or bombardment of various information at a time? Fear of missing out.
Yes, FOMO. Yes,
Yeah.
it's rather interesting. Baudrillard, in one of his books, talks about that, about fear of missing out, and it shapes a tremendous amount of human behavior. For example, people who tourists. The behavior of many tourists is shaped by fear of missing out. That is, they go on vacation, and instead of relaxing, because they're afraid of missing out, they drive themselves tremendously. I mean, they work enormously hard, making sure they cover everything. They go to every restaurant that should be gone to, and they see every site that must be seen. They do everything that you're supposed to do when you're in that particular place. So fear of missing out shapes a tremendous amount of behavior. I think when it comes to everyday life, it is a factor that in our, in much of our behavior, we don't want to miss anything. For example, it shapes when we purchase things. We want to make sure that we get the best product we can at the best price. So a psychologist has made a study in which he argues that there are two groups of people, maximizers and minimizers. The maximizers are driven by fear of missing out. That is, they're afraid that unless they do a tremendous amount of research and study and so forth and so on, if they're going to buy something, that if they had waited longer, it'd be cheaper, or they're not getting the very best somehow or another. So they're motivated by fear of missing out. The minimizers don't really give a damn. They just say, well, good enough. So that relates to human psychology, that we are, and generally, we want to sort of maximize our experiences. And so the fear of missing out shapes a lot of the things we do, because we're afraid that if we don't do it, something important that we could have benefited from or would have enjoyed and so forth will bypass us. So it leads to a kind of obsessive and compulsive behavior in people. They're absolutely driven to make sure that they don't miss out on anything. My particular theory is I'm sometimes, it's really interesting, sometimes I notice I drift into the maximizer thing, but most of the time I would describe myself as a minimizer. I think it's good enough. And that also applies to my writing. Like my wife is absolutely obsessive about my writing, making mistakes and so forth. I tend to write very quickly and then spend a lot of time going over it. And lately what I've discovered is that it's better to print it out and have my wife check it over for errors, because after I've written something so many times, I can't really read it over. It's just impossible. But she's afraid that I'm going to make mistakes, so she's driven by a fear of missing out. That is, missing errors that I've made. But the point is a very important one, I think, that if you look at human psychology, the fear of missing out may be more important than other things that drive our behavior, and that isn't always a very good thing.
Sir, there is another question.
Yeah.
Here. The question is a very important question. Here it has been asked by Manisha Mahapatra, one of the students of Central University of Odisha. She has asked that how media is playing a vital role in the pandemic.
How it's playing a role in the what?
In the pandemic, in this pandemic situation.
Oh, the pandemic. Oh, yes.
Yes,
Oh,
yes, sir.
yes. Well, that unfortunately is a very sad story, because I mean, it's one of the things that I've been really interested in is why so many people refuse to be vaccinated when it will save their lives, you know. And I think media plays a very important role in here. That is, we know, for example, that that the people who are Democrats tend to get vaccinated, but people who are Republicans tend to avoid getting vaccinated, in part because they've been watching Fox News, and Fox News has had some of its speakers, some of the people have shows saying that it's dangerous, it's useless, that the COVID is like the flu, and so a lot of it's influenced by, of course, Trump. I've written 2 books on Trump, in case you're interested, in which I use semiotic, psychoanalytic theory, and Marxist theory to analyze his behavior, and one is on Trump and one is on his followers. So we're really talking about his followers now. So we have huge numbers of people, millions of people, who because of the media, because of the way the media, especially Fox News, has covered this pandemic, are refusing to get vaccinated. Now, what's happened recently is kind of interesting, because of this new Delta variant that is so much more dangerous, that spreads so much more rapidly and so much more dangerous. We're even finding people on Fox suggesting people get vaccinated. But still, there are also, in America, there are these bunch of crazies called anti-vaxxers. They don't believe in any vaccination. And so we have a battle going on the media between the anti-vaxxers, between the Trump followers who don't want to get vaccinated because they think it's a political statement on their part, but are dying as a result of it. And then we have the people who are trying to get people to get vaccinated, For example, the president just brought in this pop singer who's very popular because we're having a lot of trouble getting young people vaccinated. They think they're immune to it. They think that nothing can harm. They're superhuman. Nothing going to hurt them. And now we're discovering that a lot of people who are ending up in the hospital in very bad shape are 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds, 20-year-olds. So this, you raise, a really interesting question. There's a battle going on. Dr. Fauci, the head of the NIH, is even on TikTok trying to get people to get vaccinated. As it stands now, as I talk to you right now, there are 100 million Americans who have not been vaccinated. So that's 1 out of every 3, something like that. A lot of it has to do with if you're in a state with a Republican governor, they don't, or they haven't in the past, suggested you get vaccinated. So there's been a lot of pressure on people not to get vaccinated, and it's very cultural too. So that battle is going on in the media, and we're trying to figure out, how much power does the media have to shape people's behavior? Well, it seems to have a tremendous amount of power. If you think about the 100 million people who've refused to get vaccinated, we're knocking ourselves out trying to get people to get vaccinated because, first of all, it saves lives and it also saves a lot of money. It costs a small fortune to deal with these people in the hospitals. So for something that costs a couple of dollars or whatever it is to save your life, to my mind, I simply cannot figure out what's going on in their mind. Obviously, it has to deal with group pressure, with ideological pressure, with the who has got vaccinated, but he hasn't made a public service announcement that might affect people. And there are even people who think that even if he does, it won't make much difference. That is a tremendously difficult question to answer. There's no question in my mind that as a result of the media, especially Fox News and other conservative media outlets, huge numbers of people who ordinarily would have been vaccinated didn't. And that is because it has turned into becoming a political question. It's not a health question for many people, it's a political question. They want to show their loyalty to conservative principles and things like that. So the answer is yes, the media have played an enormously important role. The question in my mind is, why is it that the media that is urging people to get vaccinated hasn't been more effective, and why the media that has convinced people not to get vaccinated because it's a kind of political statement has been so effective? I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah. But it's a very good question.
Yeah. Sir, can I just ask one more question? Hello?
Yes, it's
Yes.
fragmentary thinking being.
Yeah. Sir, today's this glamorized world and this particular contemporary world, the media, if media sets agenda for the society, and who sets agenda for the media? A quote unquote these particular fear and favor and terror should be always sold by these media. If you look seriously about the developed country and those are producing the war equipments, they are hugely funded, these medias, and they try to sell out every time terror, fear and everything. The psychological phenomenon is very difficult to understand what can happen in the particular realistic world. What is your assumption and what is your observations about all these media ethics and media policy as concerned?
Well, and we know that since people spend so much time with the media, it has. I mean, there are two schools about the media, as I understand it. One school is that the media doesn't play a very important role. It sort of rolls off our back like water off a duck's back. The other is that it really is very important and shapes our behavior in very profound ways. You see, I happen to, I happen to believe in the second perspective. I remember when I was doing a lot of work on pop culture, some of my colleagues in another department said, "Who cares about pop culture? It's trivial. People read the funnies, people watch advertisements, but it's irrelevant. It doesn't really mean anything. There are many more important things." I had a colleague said he was interested in social change, and that dealing with pop culture was trivial. And when I was in graduate school, it was rather interesting. I wrote my dissertation on a comic strip, Little Abner. I think it was the first dissertation on a comic strip that had been written for a PhD, at an American university. And it was in the American Studies program, so we had English professors, sociologists, political scientists, psychologists, and so forth in my committee, historians, and so forth. And the English professors couldn't get over it. I mean, they wanted students, some of my colleagues working on a PhD in American Studies, they were writing on third-rate novelists that nobody read, but it's an elite art form. And I was writing on popular culture, on a popular culture text that was read by 200 million people every day all over the world. And I was told that what I was dealing with was trivial and unimportant, but dealing with the third-rate novelists or whatever they dealt with was important because the genre was more important. Well, I'm not a scholar of data. As I told you, I was data free for many years, although I use other people's data now. But it seems to me quite obvious that if you spend 13 hours a day of your life immersed in media, it's going to have an effect on many aspects of your life. I can give you an example. I used to play a game with my students based on metaphor, and I would play them a song called "It's All in the Game." And the song goes, once in a while he won't call, but it's all in the game, all in the wonderful game called love. And so I put it into groups of three, and I would say, if love is a game, what are the implications of that? And they came up with about a dozen different things. Someone wins, someone loses, people cheat, games get boring, and so forth and so on. The reason I'm talking about that is because what it shows is that things that may seem to be trivial and unimportant, like a love song, which suggests that love is like a game, can actually be very important in terms of shaping people's understanding of what love is all about. So if you multiply that by all the songs people listen to when they're listening to the radio or on whatever channel they have with all the music, if you think about all the images to which they're exposed to when they're seeing commercials or watching news programs or watching regular programs, then you realize that if you're spending 13 hours a day in some sort of a media, it has to have an effect. It's like being in a swimming pool for 13 hours. It's going to have an effect on you. You may not emerge from that feeling too hot, and you may be pretty cold and in pretty bad shape. I think that the reason schools of media are so important is that we recognize that the media, in many respects, shape our ideas and the way we see the world and the way we think about ourselves. I mean, I gave you the example of my watching Rashomon. When I watched Rashomon, all of a sudden things changed. I had a much different view of reality. All of a sudden, nothing seemed to be quite as simple as it used to be, because remember, we have 4 different people giving 4 different versions of what happened in this grove. It's based on a short story by a Japanese writer. It was like 6 pages long, the film is absolutely marvelous because it's beautifully acted and the director is a genius. So I would say then that media is very important. Now, what's this question? Can you share some of your works in cultural criticism? Is that what somebody asked me? My works in cultural criticism? Yeah. All right. I'll tell you about some of my. You have to realize I've written now more than 80 books on what I call media, popular culture, and everyday life. And I started off with a comic strip. Then I realized, excuse me for a second. I realized people are watching comic strips, they're reading it, it takes a few minutes during the day. But what about advertisements? They're watching an hour of advertising every day. So then I wrote a book on advertising, which is a cultural study, a cultural analysis of advertising. And that is now in its 6th edition. I have written 30 different new editions of my books. So I've spent my life writing books and rewriting my books. So one of my editors said, if you want to count your new editions of your books, then you have an astronomical number of books, But I've written, if you add 80 and 30, you get this huge number of books. But I don't want to do it anymore. I'd rather write new books than rewrite old books. And somebody asked me to rewrite a book I wrote, and I decided I don't want to do it. So I wrote on advertising, which is a very interesting subject. I actually got to spend some time in an advertising agency in London, and actually spent 3 weeks in an advertising agency in America. You have no idea. It's easier to get out of to break out of a prison than to spend time in an advertising agency. They're obsessively concerned about people stealing their ideas and who knows what. So I wrote a book on advertising. That made me interested in what I call commercial culture. So, for example, I've written a number of books on commercial culture. I wrote one book called Shop Till You Drop, which is about shopping. I wrote a review of 6 or 8 books on shopping for a scholarly journal, and that made me kind of interested in shopping. So I wrote this book on shopping. Now you have to understand, my books are all formulaic. That is, some people say I've written one book 80 times. That is, if you look from one book to the other, you're going to find the sort of same mind working on them. I'm interested in what the semioticians have to say about the subject. I'm interested in what the Marxists have to say about the subject. I'm interested in what Freud has to say about the subject, so forth. So I've written several books on marketing. Right now, as we talk, I have a book on luxury that just came out, and I'm sending a book on the creative process that came out. And I've also done one on identity that's going to be coming out. So I'm sort of all over the place, but I've written quite a few books on marketing. I've written a book on marketing. I've written a book on discourse theory and pop culture. Whatever, if I find a subject that interests me and that I think is worth writing, I write it. Now, unlike many scholars, when I was at the university, people would have an idea for the book, so they would write a prospectus and send it off to a publisher and see whether they're interested. The prospectus we usually have a chapter and an outline and so forth and so on. But that's as much as they did. I don't work that way at all. If I'm interested in the subject, I write the book. And then I hope that I'll get it published. And I don't always get it published. Most of the time I get it published. Let's see if I have it here. Oh, in addition to my in addition to my writing books and writing that book on games, I also write murder mysteries on on media. So I wrote this book. I had this idea. What if I had 5 professors of media studies, each with a different theory? And what I deal with in this is different media theorists, 5 different media theorists in their work. So I had this idea. I like to kill professors in my murder mysteries. In one murder mystery I wrote, the Hamlet case, I killed 6 professors. Each had a different interpretation of Hamlet. And once they gave their interpretation of Hamlet, I killed them off. Because I had this mad professor who was afraid, he was the editor of a journal in Shakespeare, and he was afraid that the editorial board was going to get rid of him. So he killed them off before they could get rid of him. It was pretty much. So I wrote this book, Mass Comm Media, and it is a murder mystery in which 5 professors kill each other off. But they're all different media theorists. So when you read this book, you're actually learning 5 different media theories because they're all explaining their theories to one another or to the subtitle is 5 Media Theorists Self-Destruct. The problem I had with this is I couldn't figure out how to kill all 5 of them. Like I could kill 4 of them, but how do I kill the 5th one? And then I got the notion of a bomb. So once I got the notion of a bomb, I had the first person who was dead. After he was dead, though, he has already sent the bomb to the 5th person who's still alive, and that bomb kills him. So I killed them all off, and that made me sort of, I solved that problem. But students who read the book are learning media theory. And I've written quite a few. I've written a book on postmodernism called Postmortem for Postmodernists. That really is a textbook on postmodernism. In that, only 1 person got killed on the first page. And that's kind of interesting because the Chinese love that book for some reason. The Chinese have translated a dozen of my books, something like that. And they've translated 4 of my murder mysteries. The Hamlet case, in which the professor kills the Hamlet professors. Postmortem for Postmodernists, and a couple of, I don't remember which other ones. In any case, I've written a number of murder mysteries. So I have the book on the theory, media analysis techniques, which explains the 4 methodologies. I also have my book on research methods. Then I have my book on games, and I'll be happy to send the file of that book on games, because I've lectured in other universities. I've always sent them the book on games so that we can play games when I'm there, and they can learn how to, these games are sort of teaching devices. And then I've written murder mysteries. So I've gone about trying to teach students media criticism methods, media analysis techniques, whatever you want to call it, many different ways. I actually have written recently. I wrote a book on semiotics, a murder mystery in semiotics, and I wrote one on psychoanalytic theory. My notion is you could actually teach a person to be a cultural critic by reading 4 of my murder mysteries, because they'd learn Marxism, semiotics, psychoanalytic theory, and sociological theory. So I've knocked myself out trying to figure out how to teach people to analyze media and make sense of it. Of course, some people, it's perfectly valid to teach media studies a different way. Some people like to talk about other people's ideas about media and so forth and so on. And some people are quants and want to talk about quantitative studies that reflect and teach us certain things about the media use. So my theory is I have the best of both worlds. I'm basically a media theorist, but if I find stuff by a quant, I'll be happy to use it to emphasize a point. So, one last question. No, maybe we're off.
The challenge for media has been for the last couple of days. The journalists, particularly, the Jamal Khashoggi case in 2018 or 2002, the Daniel Paul case in Pakistan. And today's journalists or the journalism is facing a lot of challenges from the government, the established government, particularly there in the United States. In the past, the CNN versus the Trump administration. Here in India, the ruling party and the NDTV. How do you look to this challenge, the media or the journalists challenge facing from the ruling party, particularly there in America or any other place in the world?
Well, first of all, in America, we don't really have a ruling party. And so journalists have much more freedom here than they do in countries like Pakistan or India or many other countries where the political system is much more controlling, or Turkey and so forth, so on. I can't tell you, how to deal with what's going on in Pakistan, because I'm not familiar with Pakistan, India, Turkey and so forth and so on to any great degree. It's an act of bravery. Many journalists in these countries are actually very brave in writing the material they do, and all too frequently, unfortunately, they're punished for it. So journalism in certain countries is actually a risky business. It's very risky, and in a lot of places they kill them. People are killed, journalists are killed because the authorities or people who are very ideologically based feel that they have to eliminate these journalists. So my heart goes out to the journalists in these countries who have to deal with these regimes. In America, we have all kinds of journalists. We have people on the very far right. We have fascists. We have neo-fascists. I think Trump is basically a fascist. But he's not in control, and we have. And even when he was in control, he couldn't control the left-wing media. So we have the right-wing media, we have the middle-of-the-road media, and we have the left-wing media. And now, as I speak, books by journalists are coming out about Trump one after another. I think that the people have written about something like 500 books on Trump. You have to understand, Trump was something we've never seen before, and I hope we never see again. But he's actually talking about running in 2024. I don't know whether he will or not, but because he's afraid of losing. That's an important part of his psyche. But in any case, so we're talking about different worlds. If you talk about like Germany, France, England, America, you have a much different situation with journalists. Basically, they're free to write what they want if they can find a platform. And in America, we have crazy platforms for right-wing people, and then we have platforms for left-wing people, and then we have in the middle we have the networks, and CNN and things like that. There's a tremendous amount of material available. That is, my wife and I. Generally, after dinner, we watch a little bit of news, and we watch different stations. The Wall Street Journal has stuff, CBS has stuff, CNN has stuff, MSNBC has stuff. There's an enormous amount of material available if you want it. You could spend your life just watching these programs. So we watch for about an hour, and then. If there's a nature program or Nova programs, some sort of a documentary, we watch that. We don't usually watch more than an hour and a half of television, but and sometimes we don't watch anything to speak of, maybe half an hour of news. But we're most unusual because, my wife was a philosophy professor and I'm a professor, so we're not the standard American media consumer. We're very unusual. We're also super senior citizens, so that affects things a little bit too. But how journalists negotiate in countries like China and Pakistan, India, and so forth, it's a real problem, because there, in many cases, their lives are in danger, or certainly their occupations are in danger, and so there's a certain amount of bravery and courage involved in being a journalist in these countries, and my hat goes out to them, because it's very difficult to function in a society like that, where your living or even your life can be terminated at the whim of a politician or a kind of fanatic, political fanatic. Yeah. That is about as much as I'm able to say. My voice is beginning to go out on me, but it's been very, very enjoyable for me talking to you people, and I hope that you'll have learned something of interest to you that will make my efforts worthwhile.
Thank you so much, Professor Arthur. I think we should stop here, Dr. Jena.
Yes.
Yes, I want to stop now.
Yes.
Okay.
I have work to do. You may not believe it, but I told you I have like 3 books in the process of being produced. I have to go over them and check them over, because I have to send one off to my publisher in a few days, and the other one is due in a couple of weeks. So I've got a lot of work to do.
Yes, sure, sir. Dr. Jena, should we stop?
Yes. Go for vote of thanks.
Yes. Okay. On behalf of all the participants and organizers of the World Human Sciences and Management Conference, I express my deep sense of gratitude to Professor Arthur from US. Again, thank you so much and very much, Professor Arthur, for accepting our invitation from your busy schedule and joined us in this global digital platform all the way from San Francisco. We are really thankful and grateful to you. And also, I'm thankful to all the patrons of this conference, Madhav Jaiswal, the IIM Director, I. Rama Brahma, of the Vice Chancellor of the Central University of Odisha, Koraput, and also I thank to Chandi Prasad Nanda, Charidat Panigrahi, Sarat Kumar Palit, and all the technical supporters and coordinators, Mr. Subham Das, Mr. Kamal Prasad Mahanti, Ghanshyam Giri, Chinmay Kumar Sahu, Aniruddha Jena, and Mrs. and Mr. Priyanka Das and Rudranayan Das, and also thankful to Dr. Nupur Patnaik and all the students and scholars, those who have actively participated, Manisha Mahapatra, Satabdi, Ananya, Milanjana, Snigdha, and all the participants. And also I'm thankful to Dr. Subhash Chandra Barik, Dr. Priyadar Sikar, and Dr. Syama Prasad Misra, and also all the students of my IIM Sambalpur and Koraput Central University and Ravenshaw University, Patak. And also I'm last but the most important person who gathered all of us together in this digital platform, Dr. Vikram Kesarjana, who the director of the Center for ADIVASI Research and Development, Bhubaneswar, India. We all are thankful and grateful to Dr. Jena. Thank you all. Stay well, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay tuned. We look forward to see you again all. Till then, bye-bye.
Advance congratulations, Professor Berger, for your upcoming books. Thank you so much for joining with us.
My
Great day
pleasure.
ahead.
I'm just sorry, my computer, the sound is not very good, so I had a lot of trouble sometimes hearing you and understanding you, but we managed one way or the other.
Thank you.